It is a singular object, carved from a block of weathered wood, articulated at the wrist and knuckles, and stained by a century of reverence. It does not possess the warmth of skin or the flexibility of muscle. It is a prosthetic, a mechanical replacement for a limb lost to a cannon blast in the Crimean War. For most of the year, it sits encased in a glass reliquary within a high-security vault in Aubagne, France. But once a year, on the 30th of April, it is brought out under armed guard and carried by a veteran of the Legion along the way of the sacred wood. It is the wooden hand of Captain Jean d'Anjou. To a civilian, it is a macabre artifact. To the French state, it is a historical curiosity. But to the 8,000 men of the French Foreign Legion, it is the center of their spiritual universe. It represents the exact moment in 1863 when 65 men, surrounded by 2,000 Mexican infantry and cavalry at a ruined hacienda called Cameron, decided that the contract was more important than the soul. They fought for 10 hours without food or water, rejecting every offer of surrender, until only 3 men remained standing with fixed bayonets. They did not fight for the glory of the Second French Empire, which would eventually collapse. They did not fight for the soil of Mexico, which they did not own. They fought because they had signed a piece of paper that said they would die for the Legion. And in the architecture of the Legionnaire's mind, that paper is the only truth that remains in a world of lies. The French Foreign Legion is an institution built on a foundation of systematic erasure. It is perhaps the only place on earth where a man can arrive at a gate with a history of failure, crime, or tragedy, and find a bureaucracy that is not only willing to ignore his past, but is legally mandated to destroy it. If you find this clinical exploration of military psychology and the mechanics of human identity compelling, consider subscribing to the channel. We analyze the world's most enigmatic units, not through the lens of Hollywood heroics, but through the cold reality of their institutional design. Leave a like if you value this level of research, and in the comments I would be interested in your perspective. Is it possible for a man to truly start over, or is the new identity simply a mask for the scars of the old one? Your engagement helps us continue to produce these long-form, detail-heavy analyses. To understand the Legion, one must first understand the gate at Aubagne. In a standard military recruitment center, the process is one of expansion. A citizen brings his high school diploma, his medical records, his family history, and his aspirations. He is a person being integrated into a larger system. At the Premier Régiment Étranger in Aubagne, the process is one of contraction. When a man walks up to the gate, whether he is a former architect from Tokyo, a paratrooper from Russia, or a bankrupt laborer from Poland, the first thing the Legion does is take his phone. They take his passport. They take his civilian clothes. He is no longer a citizen. He is a candidate. The Legion operates on a principle called anonymat. Within the first 48 hours, the candidate is issued a new identity, a declared identity, a new name, a new date of birth, and a new place of birth. A man named Stefan from Berlin might become Mark from Belgium. This is not a suggestion. It is a mechanical stripping of the self. For the next 5 years, the candidate will be known only by this mask. The Legion does not care if the name is real. They care that the individual behind the name is dead. This process is overseen by a department known colloquially as the Gestapo, the DSPLE, Direction de Services de Protection et de Légion Étrangère. This is the Legion's internal intelligence and security branch. Their interrogation process is not designed to find the best soldiers. It is designed to find the men who have nowhere else to go. The DSPLE interrogators are masters of the psychological autopsy. They will sit a candidate in a room for hours, days, even weeks. They will ask the same questions about his mother, his debts, his criminal record, and his reasons for being there. They cross-reference his answers with Interpol databases and their own massive archives. They are looking for the lie. If a man is running from a murder, he is usually rejected. If he is running from a failed marriage, a bankrupt business, or a minor criminal past, he is perfect. The philosophy is cold and pragmatic. A man with a home, a bank account, and a loving family is a man with something to lose. He will hesitate when the order comes to march into a desert he has never heard of. But a man who has been erased, a man who officially does not exist, is a man who has found a new fatherland in the Legion. Legio Patria Nostra. The Legion is our fatherland. This is the fundamental contrast between a regular army and the Foreign Legion. A regular soldier fights to protect his home. A legionnaire fights because he no longer has one. The training at Castelnaudary is designed to solidify this erasure through physical and psychological attrition. In the regular French army, training is a modern pedagogical process. There are instructors, feedback loops, and a focus on technical proficiency. In the Legion, the training is a 19th century vestige. It is built on the premise that the individual's comfort is an obstacle to the unit's survival. Sleep deprivation is the baseline. Physical exhaustion is the constant. The instruction is delivered in a broken, functional French that every recruit must learn through repetition and punishment. If one man fails to memorize the Legionnaire's Code of Honor, the entire section is punished. The Code of Honor is a 7-point document that functions as the new moral compass for the erased man.
Point 1. Legionnaire. You are a volunteer serving France with honor and fidelity. Point 2. Every legionnaire is your brother in arms, regardless of his nationality, his race, or his religion. You will demonstrate this by the strict solidarity which must always unite the members of the same family. Note the language: family, brother, solidarity. The Legion is not a job. It is a replacement for the soul. The system takes a group of men who share no common language, no common history, and often a mutual distrust, and it welds them together through a shared experience of suffering. They are taught that the only thing that will keep them alive in the Sahel, in the jungles of French Guiana, or in the mountains of Afghanistan is the man to their left and the man to their right. This leads to the cult of the disposable soldier. Historically, the French state has viewed the Legion as a strategic luxury. Because the legionnaires are not French citizens, their deaths do not carry the same political weight as the deaths of French conscripts. When a legionnaire dies in a combat operation, there are no protests in the streets of Paris. There are no angry editorials in Le Monde. The body is brought back to Aubagne, a small service is held in the internal courtyard, and the name is added to a list. This mechanical coldness is what allows the Legion to be sent into the most high-risk environments. They are the point of the spear, because the spear is designed to be broken and replaced. However, the legionnaire himself does not see his life as disposable. He sees it as traded. He has traded his old, messy, failed life for a new, clean, disciplined one. He has traded his freedom for the security of the contract. The contract is the skwoznaya metafora, the through-line metaphor, of the Legion's existence. It is not just a legal document, it is a philosophical covenant. The wooden hand of Captain d'Anjou is the symbol of that contract. D'Anjou and his men did not fight to save France. They fought because their orders said, "Hold this position until death." To retreat would be to violate the contract. To violate the contract would be to admit that their erasure was a failure. In the modern world, where identity is fluid, digital, and constantly broadcasted, the Foreign Legion remains an anomaly. It is a place of shadows and silence. It is a machine that takes the broken parts of the world and reassembles them into a force of terrifying, objective lethality. But as the world changes, so does the nature of the man at the gate. In the 19th century, the recruits were often revolutionaries and political exiles. After 1945, they were often former soldiers of the Wehrmacht and the SS,
seeking to disappear into the army of shadows. After 1991, they were the dispossessed soldiers of the Soviet Union. Today, they are the economic migrants of the digital age and the veterans of the wars in the Middle East. The faces change, but the gait remains the same. The DSPLE still asks the same questions. The wooden hand still waits in the vault, and the individual still waits to be erased. In the next part, we will examine the Black Room of the Legion, the deployment into the colonial wars of the 20th century. We will see what happens when the erased man is sent to die in the mud of Dien Bien Phu and the mountains of Algeria. We will see the moment when the Legion, abandoned by the French state, turned its bayonets on Paris itself. The contract was signed. The price was about to be paid in blood. Ensure you are subscribed so you do not miss Part 2, where we go deep into the ballistics, the tactical failures, and the grim reality of the paratrooper regiments of the Legion. The sun is rising over the barracks, and the march is about to begin. Marche ou crève. March or die. It is a low, rhythmic thumping, felt in the marrow of the bone before it is heard by the ear.
It is the sound of 80,000 boots hitting the sun-baked earth of the Algerian desert in perfect, synchronized cadence. This is the Pas Légionnaire, the Legion's march. While the standard French army marches at 120 paces per minute, the Foreign Legion marches at a slow, deliberate 88. It is a pace designed for the long haul, for the endless expanses of the Sahara, for the soldier who knows that haste is a luxury of the amateur. To a spectator at a Bastille Day parade, the slow march is a display of tradition. To the legionnaire, it is a psychological weapon. It signals that the Legion is an entity that does not hurry because it does not fear the passage of time. It is an institution that calculates its movements in decades and its sacrifices in thousands. In the mid-20th century, the French Foreign Legion faced a crisis of existence that no training manual could have predicted. The era of colonial expansion was dying, replaced by the violent, agonizing birth of decolonization. The Legion, an organization designed to conquer and hold the edges of an empire, suddenly found itself serving a nation that was increasingly ashamed of its own imperial past. This created a profound internal friction. The erased man, the individual who had traded his identity for the protection of the French state, found himself being deployed into conflicts where the state itself was in a state of moral and political collapse. By 1946, the French were attempting to reclaim their colonies in Indochina. They viewed the conflict through the lens of a 19th century colonial police action. They believed that their superior technology, their air power, and their professional officer class would easily suppress the peasant uprising of the Viet Minh. They were catastrophically wrong. The war in the jungles of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia was the first great collision between the industrialized Western military machine and the revolutionary asymmetric warfare of the East. The French army, exhausted by the Second World War and politically divided, struggled to maintain its momentum. The French public, tired of the dirty war, la sale guerre, began to demand a withdrawal. But the Foreign Legion did not have a public. It did not have a vote. It only had the contract. If you are beginning to appreciate the clinical, unvarnished reality of these military transformations, please take a moment to subscribe and ensure you are notified of our future deep dives. We strive to provide an objective analysis of history's most enigmatic units, moving beyond the myths to find the cold, institutional truth. In the comments, I would be interested in your analysis. Can a military unit remain effective when it is fighting for a cause that its own civilian population has already abandoned? Your feedback helps us shape the direction of our research. In the mud of Indochina, the Legionnaire's erasure took on a grim, literal meaning. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954
was the ultimate expression of the French military's failure to adapt to the new reality of warfare. The French command, led by General Henri Navarre, devised a plan to lure the Viet Minh into a set-piece battle in a remote valley in northwestern Vietnam. They believed that by establishing a massive, fortified airhead, a hedgehog defense, they could force the enemy to attack them in the open, where French artillery and air power would annihilate them. The hedgehog was named after a woman, Isabelle, Beatrice, Gabrielle, Anne-Marie. These were the strong points of Dien Bien Phu. The force sent into the valley was a mosaic of the French Empire, but its backbone was the Foreign Legion. 7 of the 17 infantry battalions at Dien Bien Phu were legionnaires. They were the paratroopers of the Premier BEP, Foreign Parachute Battalion, and the veteran infantry of the 13e DBLE, 13th Foreign Legion Half Brigade. General Vo Nguyen Giap, the commander of the Viet Minh, did not play by the French rules. He did not attack in the open. Instead, he did the impossible. He moved dozens of heavy artillery pieces, supplied by China and the Soviet Union, through the supposedly impassable jungle-covered mountains surrounding the valley. He used tens of thousands of peasants to hand-carry shells and dismantle cannons, reassembling them in camouflaged pits overlooking the French positions. The French hedgehog was not a fortress. It was a trap. When the first Viet Minh shells began to fall on the 13th of March, the French command was paralyzed. Their own artillery was outranged and outpositioned. The airstrip, the only lifeline for supplies and reinforcements, was destroyed within days. The French soldiers were trapped in a valley of fire. The legionnaires at Dien Bien Phu did not fight for the survival of French Indochina. They fought for the solidarity dictated by the Code of Honor. They watched as their strongpoints were overrun by human wave attacks of Viet Minh infantry. They fought in trenches that were filled with monsoon rain, mud, and the stench of decomposing bodies. The psychological transformation of the legionnaire at Dien Bien Phu was absolute. The erased man had found a new family in his regiment, and now he was watching that family be methodically slaughtered in a hole in the ground. The wooden hand of Captain Danjou, which was present in the command bunker, became the silent observer of their ultimate sacrifice. When the paratroopers of the 1st BEP jumped into the valley as reinforcements, they knew they were jumping into a lost cause. They knew the fortress would fall. They jumped because their brothers were already there. On the 7th of May, 1954, Dien Bien Phu collapsed. 10,000 French and Legionnaire troops were taken prisoner. They were forced to march 500 miles through the jungle to prisoner-of-war camps. Half of them died on the march.
The Indochina War was over. The French Empire was broken. But for the Legion, the true catastrophe was just beginning. The survivors returned to their home base in Algeria, Sidi Bel Abbès. This city was the spiritual heart of the Legion. It was where the monument to the dead stood. It was where the archives were kept. Algeria was the Legion's motherland. But Algeria was also on the verge of its own revolution. The FLN, Front de Libération Nationale, had begun a violent campaign for independence. The French state, desperate to avoid another Dien Bien Phu, sent its most elite units into the mountains of Algeria. They sent the paratroopers of the Premier Rep, 1st Foreign Parachute Regiment. These men were the veterans of Indochina. They were hard, cynical, and highly professional. They had been erased once by their pasts, and erased a second time by the defeat in Vietnam. They felt betrayed by the politicians in Paris. They began to view themselves not as servants of the state, but as the state itself. In the Battle of Algiers in 1957, the paratroopers used brutal, efficient counterinsurgency tactics to dismantle the FLN network in the city. They used intelligence-led raids, surveillance, and, controversially, systematic torture. The Legion paratroopers were the thinking soldiers of the colonial war. They understood that in an insurgency, the center of gravity is not territory, but information. They won the Battle of Algiers. They stabilized the country. But they were winning a war that Paris had already decided was a lost cause. In 1958, Charles de Gaulle returned to power in France. The military, and the Legion paratroopers in particular, believed that de Gaulle would keep Algeria French. They viewed him as their ultimate commander. But de Gaulle was a pragmatist. He realized that the era of colonialism was finished. He began to negotiate for Algerian independence. To the men of the First Rep, this was the ultimate betrayal of the contract. They had fought and died for Algeria for over a century. They had built the roads, the cities, and the barracks. They had been told that Algeria is France. In April 1961, the elite of the Legion paratroopers did the unthinkable. They rebelled. The putsch of the generals was a military coup attempt designed to seize control of Algiers and force the French government to abandon its plans for independence. The first REP was at the center of the revolt. They seized the government buildings in Algiers. They stood ready to march on Paris. The erased men had turned their bayonets on the hand that fed them. The coup failed. De Gaulle used the radio to appeal directly to the conscript soldiers in Algeria, bypassing the rebellious officers. The military hierarchy collapsed. The consequences for the Legion were devastating. The First Rep, the most elite regiment in the history of the Legion, was disbanded. The officers were arrested. The soldiers were redistributed to other units. The Legion's home in Sidi Bel Abbes was abandoned as Algeria gained independence. The Legion was forced to move its headquarters to Aubagne on the French mainland. They had lost their desert. They had lost their motherland. They were an army of shadows living in a modern, democratic nation that viewed them with suspicion and fear. Many analysts at the time predicted that the Foreign Legion would be abolished. They were a 19th century anachronism in a 20th century world. They were a mercenary force that had tried to overthrow the government. But the French state realized a cold, tactical truth. They still needed a disposable army. They needed a force that could be sent into the grey zones of the Cold War, into the former colonies of Africa where French interests were still at stake. They needed a force that could fight without the political oversight of the French Parliament. The Legion survived because it was useful. The architecture of erasure was rebuilt. The training at Castelnaudary was modernized, but the core philosophy remained. The Gestapo continued to interrogate the men at the gate. The pas légionnaire remained at 88 paces per minute. If this deep dive into the institutional resilience and psychological complexity of the Legion provides a new perspective on military history, please ensure you are subscribed. We focus on the intersection of human psychology and military doctrine, removing the cinematic tropes to find the cold truth. In the comments, I would be interested in your thoughts. Does the Legion's survival after its revolt prove that a professional military will always be prioritized by a state over its own democratic principles? The legionnaire of the post-colonial era was a different kind of man. He was no longer a defender of the empire. He was a contract soldier of the global Cold War. In the 1970s and 80s, the Legion was deployed into the Kolwezi raid in Zaire, a spectacular display of paratrooper capability that saved thousands of European hostages. They were deployed into the deserts of Chad, the jungles of Djibouti, and the ruins of Beirut.
They were the firemen of Africa, but the erasure was becoming more complex. In the 19th century, a man could disappear into the desert and never be seen again. In the age of satellite surveillance, digital banking, and global communication, how do you truly erase a man? The DSPLE had to evolve. They became masters of digital forensics. They realized that a man's identity is no longer just a passport. It is a digital footprint. To hide a legionnaire, the system had to learn how to manipulate the digital world. The wooden hand of Captain Danjou remained in its vault, a silent witness to the Legion's transition from the colonial age to the digital age. It remained the symbol of the contract, the idea that no matter how much the world changed, the soldier's duty was to remain until the end. In the next part, we will examine the modern Legion, the digital shadows of the 21st century. We will see how they operated in the mountains of Afghanistan, the streets of Mali, and the training grounds of the modern special operations community. We will see the thinking legionnaire in the age of drones and cyber warfare. The march continues, 88 paces per minute, toward a future that is as uncertain as the past was violent. The contract is still active. The erasure is still absolute. Stay with us. The most intimate details of the modern Legion are about to be revealed. It is a stiff cylindrical cap made of cotton and polyester, reinforced by a rigid internal frame. Its surface is treated with a specific type of white chalk, applied by hand, to ensure a blinding, pristine finish that reflects the harsh light of the African sun. To the French public, the Kepi Blanc is a symbol of military romanticism, a relic of a vanished colonial era. But inside the barracks of the 12e Régiment Étranger de Parachutistes in Calvi, Corsica, the white kepi is a psychological mask. It is designed to be so uniform, so perfect, and so devoid of individuality that it effectively finishes what the recruitment process started: the total aesthetic and mental absorption of the man into the institution. When a legionnaire puts on the kepi blanc, he is signaling that the erasure is complete. He is no longer a man with a biography. He is a component of a tradition. He is a soldier who has moved from the shame of the 1961 revolt into a new, cold era of professional utility. In the decades following the loss of Algeria, the French Foreign Legion underwent a radical structural and philosophical reconstruction. The French state, now a medium-sized European power rather than a global empire, found itself in a strategic dilemma. It still had significant economic and political interests in Africa, what the critics called France-Afrique, but it no longer had the domestic appetite for large-scale military interventions. The French public, traumatized by the defeats in Indochina and the civil unrest of the Algerian War, would not tolerate the sight of French conscripts returning in body bags from conflicts in the Congo, Chad, or Djibouti. The solution was a return to the Legion's original, pragmatic purpose: the disposable army. The Legion was reorganized as the rapid reaction force of the French state. While the regular French army focused on the potential armored clash with the Soviet Union on the North German plain, the Legion was tasked with firefighting. They were the troops that could be deployed within 24 hours to stabilize a pro-French regime, rescue European hostages, or suppress a coup in a former colony, all without a vote in the National Assembly. This brings us to the most spectacular and tactically significant operation in the Legion's post-colonial history: Operation Bonite, the 1978 raid on Kolwezi. If you are beginning to appreciate the intricate balance of geopolitics, tactical innovation, and the cold logic of state-sponsored violence, please take a moment to subscribe and ensure you are notified of our future investigations. We focus on the granular details that define these elite units, moving beyond the myths to find the institutional truth. In the comments, I would be interested in your analysis. Is the use of foreign troops for state interests a necessary pragmatism of modern geopolitics, or a dangerous avoidance of democratic accountability?
Your feedback allows us to sustain this level of rigorous, objective reporting. In May 1978, the mining town of Kolwezi, in what was then Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, was seized by approximately 4,000 Katangan rebels.
The rebels were well armed, supported by Angola and Soviet advisors, and highly motivated. They began a systematic campaign of terror against the town's population, including nearly 3,000 European mining technicians and their families. Massacres were reported. The survivors were huddled in schools and hotels, waiting for a rescue that the world believed was logistically impossible. The French government, led by Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, decided to act. But they faced a terrifying technical challenge. Kolwezi was 6,000 kilometers from France. There was no nearby airbase. The town was surrounded by dense jungle and defended by a rebel force that significantly outnumbered any rescue element. They turned to the 2nd REP, the 2nd Foreign Parachute Regiment. The 2nd REP was the direct descendant of the paratrooper units that had rebelled in 1961. After the putsch, the regiment had been moved to Corsica and placed under the most intense discipline in the Legion. They were no longer the thinking rebels. They were the honed edge. Every man in the regiment was a specialist: divers, snipers, mountain warfare experts, and demolitionists. They were the elite of the erased men. The logistics of Operation Bonite were a masterpiece of improvisation. Because the French Air Force lacked the long-range transport capacity to move a full regiment across Africa, the Legionnaires were squeezed into 5 American-built C-130 Hercules and Transall aircraft. They flew for 8 hours through the night, crossing the Mediterranean and the Sahara. The tactical plan was nearly suicidal: a daytime parachute drop directly into an urban environment controlled by a superior enemy force. When the green light flashed inside the C-130s at 2:30 p.m. on May 19th, the Legionnaires jumped from an altitude of only 250 meters. This was low-level jumping, designed to minimize their time in the air where they were vulnerable to rebel machine guns. They carried no reserve parachutes to save weight, and because at 250 meters, a reserve would not have time to open. They jumped with their primary weapons, their ammunition, and their absolute faith in the contract. The visual of the képi blanc was gone. In the sky over Kolwezi, the Legionnaires wore the camouflage of the 1970s, the tenue de sol leopard. They hit the ground in the middle of a built-up area, often landing in backyards or on rooftops. The Battle of Kolwezi was an intimate, street-by-street slaughter. The Katangan rebels, many of whom were veterans of previous African civil wars, were not easily intimidated. They used the town's concrete buildings as bunkers, firing from windows and rooftops. The Legionnaires had to clear the town house by house, room by room. The disposable soldier philosophy was manifested in their aggression. The 2nd Rep did not wait for artillery or air support. They didn't have any. They relied on speed, violence of action, and the solidarity of the small team. They used the FAMAS rifle, the iconic clarion of the French military, and 89mm anti-tank rockets to blast through the walls of the rebel-held buildings. Within 48 hours, the 600 men of the 2E Rep had neutralized the rebel force and secured the town. They found the European survivors, terrified, traumatized, but alive. The cost to the Legion was 5 dead and 20 wounded. The rebel casualties were estimated at over 300. Operation Bonite was hailed as a tactical miracle. It proved that the French Foreign Legion was the premier intervention force of the Western world. It restored the Legion's reputation in the eyes of the French state. But beneath the triumph was a chilling reality. The Legionnaires who fought at Kolwezi were erased men from all over the world. Germans, Poles, Americans, and Vietnamese,
all fighting under the French flag in a country that most of them could not find on a map 2 days earlier.
They were not fighting for the freedom of Zaire. They were not fighting for the technocrats in Brussels. They were fighting to prove that their erasure had value. This is the psychological contract of the Cold War legionnaire. In the 19th century, the erasure was a way to hide from the past. In the 20th century, the erasure became a way to belong to the only family that would accept them. The regiment was the mother, the father, and the law. This leads to the cult of the béret vert, the green beret. While the képi blanc is for the parade, the green beret is for the life of the soldier. In the barracks of Calvi or Aubagne, a legionnaire treats his beret with a reverence that borderlines on the religious. He shapes it, he cleans it, and he wears it with an aggressive, tilted angle that signals his status as an elite. To lose your beret, or to have it taken by an officer as a punishment, is a psychological wound more severe than a physical beating. It is a temporary un-erasure, a return to being the failed individual instead of the elite legionnaire. By the 1980s, the Legion had expanded its firefighting role. They were deployed into Lebanon as part of the multinational force in Beirut. This was a different kind of war, an urban, sectarian nightmare of snipers, car bombs, and invisible enemies. In Beirut, the disposable nature of the Legion was put to the ultimate test. When the Hezbollah suicide bombers struck the barracks of the American Marines and the French paratroopers in 1983, killing nearly 300 soldiers, the Western world was shocked. The Americans withdrew. The regular French army withdrew. But the Foreign Legion stayed. They stayed because they are an institution designed for static resilience. They remained in the ruins of Beirut, patrolling the Green Line, absorbing sniper fire and rocket attacks. They didn't have a domestic constituency to answer to. The legionnaire's erasure meant that his presence in Lebanon did not trigger the same political Vietnam syndrome that paralyzed the United States. The state used the Legion as a strategic buffer, a way to maintain presence in a lethal environment without paying the domestic price of a conventional military presence. This brings us back to the architecture of erasure. In the 1980s, the recruitment process was becoming even more sophisticated. The Gestapo, the internal security branch, was now dealing with a new wave of candidates. The Cold War was reaching its climax, and men were fleeing the disintegrating economies of the Eastern Bloc. Former Soviet officers, East German border guards, and Polish dissidents were arriving at the gates of Aubagne. The DSPLE interrogators realized that these men were the perfect recruits. They were highly trained, they possessed an intimate knowledge of the Soviet enemy, and they were utterly desperate. The Legion offered them a clean slate and a passport to the West. The Gestapo would sit a former Spetsnaz operator in an interrogation room and offer him the deal. Give us your past, give us your knowledge, and we will give you a name, a paycheck, and a future. But if you lie to us, we will return you to the border. The erasure was no longer just about hiding a criminal past. It was about the capture of expertise. The Legion was becoming a repository of the world's most dangerous men, unified under the French flag and the slow 88-pace march. This leads to the final evolution of the 20th century Legion, the birth of the second REG, the Foreign Engineer Regiment. They realized that the modern battlefield required more than just paratroopers. It required specialists who could operate in the mountains, clear minefields, and build infrastructure in the most hostile environments on Earth. The erased man was now an engineer. He was a professional who used the pukko not to kill, but to probe for mines in the mountains of Djibouti or the ruins of Sarajevo. The wooden hand of Captain d'Anjou remained in its glass case, but its meaning was shifting. In 1863, it represented a suicidal stand for a piece of paper. In the 1980s, it represented the cold, institutional continuity of a force that had survived the collapse of two empires and the revolt of its own officers. The Legion was now a digital shadow. Their operations in Africa and the Middle East were increasingly shrouded in secrecy. They were the force that France used when it wanted to act without being seen. But as the Cold War ended and the 1990s began, the Legion was about to face a new kind of conflict. They were about to be sent into the First Gulf War, and then into the ethnic cleansing of the Balkans. They were about to discover that in the New World Order, the erasure would be tested by the intrusive eyes of the global media and the rise of international law. The disposable soldier was about to become very visible. If this deep objective analysis of military history and institutional resilience provides a new lens through which to view the world's most enigmatic units, please leave a comment with your thoughts. How does a military force maintain its anonymity in the age of global transparency? Your interaction signals the algorithm to support this type of unsensationalized, detail-heavy content. Subscribe so you do not miss Part 4. The sun is setting over the barracks at Urbania. The legionnaires are preparing for the evening roll call. The KP Blancs are cleaned, the green berets are tilted, and the past is buried under the weight of the contract. But the shadows of the next war are already stretching across the desert, and the erased man is the only one who is ready to walk into them. The march continues, 88 paces per minute, toward the collapse of the old order and the chaos of the new. Stay with us.
The secrets of the 21st century Legion are about to be declassified. It is a standard sheet of A4 paper, fed through a government-issue laser printer in a windowless room in Aubagne. It is not made of parchment, it bears no wax seals, and it is devoid of the calligraphic flourishes of the Napoleonic era. It is a sterile, bureaucratic form, with boxes for nom de naissance, birth name, and identité déclarée, declared identity. Once the ink dries and the recruit's thumbprint is pressed into the corner, this piece of paper becomes a soul-binding contract. It is the physical proof of the anonymat. It is the shield that protects the man from his creditors, his enemies, and his own failures. But it is also the shroud that buries his true self for the duration of his service. To the lawyers in Paris, this paper is a legal exemption. To the recruit, it is a ticket to a second life. But to the institution, it is a tool of absolute control. By granting a man a new name, the Legion severs his last link to the civilian world's legal and moral protections. He no longer exists in the eyes of his home country's embassy. He cannot vote, he cannot marry without permission, and he cannot own property under his true name. He is a ghost in the machine, a shadow that the French state can deploy into the most lethal environments with total deniability. In the final decade of the 20th century, this architecture of erasure faced its most severe challenge. The world was transitioning from the binary, predictable standoff of the Cold War into a chaotic, multipolar New World Order. The Foreign Legion, which had thrived in the shadows of colonial brushfire wars and deniable African interventions, was suddenly thrust into the blinding light of the global media and the rigid constraints of international peacekeeping. The year 1991 marked the beginning of this transition.
When Saddam Hussein's Iraqi army invaded Kuwait, the French government realized that the firemen of Africa were the only units ready for immediate, high-intensity desert combat. Operation Daguet, the French contribution to the First Gulf War, was a moment of institutional vindication for the Legion.
For years, the regular French army had been criticized as a heavy force, designed for a European war that would never happen. But the Legion's 6th Division Légère Blindée, 6th Light Armored Division, was built for the desert. They were mobile, they were aggressive, and they were experts in austerity logistics. If you are beginning to grasp the profound institutional resilience and the cold, tactical pragmatism that defines the Foreign Legion, please take a moment to subscribe and ensure you are notified of our future investigations. We dissect military history as a study of human limits and bureaucratic design, moving beyond the myths to find the unvarnished truth. In the comments, I would be interested in your analysis. In an era of global surveillance and digital footprints, is the anonymous soldier still a viable strategic asset, or is it a relic of a simpler age? Your engagement helps us sustain this level of rigorous, objective storytelling. In the sands of Iraq and Kuwait, the thinking legionnaire proved his worth in a conventional theater. While the American armored divisions relied on massive, slow-moving logistical tales, the legionnaires of the Premier REC, 1st Foreign Cavalry Regiment, and the 2e REI, 2nd Foreign Infantry Regiment, operated with a speed that shocked their allies. They were the left hook of the coalition forces, using the AMX-10RC, a wheeled, highly mobile light tank that reflected the Legion's preference for speed over armor. They raced across the western Iraqi desert, bypassing fixed defenses and capturing thousands of Iraqi soldiers who had been demoralized by weeks of coalition bombing. The Gulf War was, for the Legion, a clean war. It was a war of movement, of clear objectives, and of overwhelming technological superiority. There were no messy colonial politics, no civilian insurgencies, and no moral grey zones. The Legionnaires, many of whom were veterans of the Cold War's shadow conflicts, thrived in the mechanical purity of the desert strike. But the New World Order was not to be defined by clean desert strikes. It was to be defined by the humanitarian nightmare. In 1992, the Legion was deployed into the disintegrating remains of Yugoslavia. This was the antithesis of the Legion's DNA. They were sent into Sarajevo as UN Blue Helmets, peacekeepers, for the erased man, whose entire training was built on the principle of marche ou crève, march or die, and the aggressive violence of action. The Bosnian War was a psychological torture. They were stationed in Sniper Alley in Sarajevo, tasked with protecting humanitarian convoys while being forbidden by the United Nations Rules of Engagement, ROE, from shooting back unless directly fired upon. The Legionnaires of the 2nd REP, 2nd Foreign Parachute Regiment, found themselves standing in the middle of a sectarian slaughterhouse, watching through their binoculars as civilians were targeted by snipers and being ordered to do nothing. The thinking soldier was being told to stop thinking and start absorbing fire. The frustration within the ranks was absolute. The contract was being tested. The Legionnaire had traded his identity for the right to be a warrior, not a target. In the ruins of Sarajevo, the solidarity of the Legion was the only thing that prevented a total morale collapse. They developed their own grey ROE, finding ways to neutralize threats without officially violating the UN mandate. They became masters of the counter-sniper operation, using their elite marksmen to quietly eliminate the threats that the bureaucracy refused to acknowledge. This brings us to a physical detail that the anonymat cannot hide: the Legionnaire's tattoo. Despite the strict prohibition on individuality, the Legion has a deep, subterranean culture of ink. A man might arrive at Oban and be given a new name, but his skin still carries the map of his past. Throughout the 1990s, the Gestapo, the DSPLE, began to notice a shift in the tattoos of the recruits. They were seeing Cyrillic script, the emblems of Soviet Spetsnaz units, and the scars of the Balkan conflicts. The tattoo is the one thing the Legion cannot erase.
It is a permanent record of where the man has been. In the barracks, the tattoos serve as a silent language. A legionnaire can look at the ink on his brother-in-arm's forearm and know exactly what kind of wars he has fought, what kind of prisons he has occupied, and what kind of failures he is running from. The tattoo is the unerased identity. It is the truth that exists beneath the identité déclarée. The 1990s also saw the Legion face its darkest moral challenge: Rwanda. In 1994, during Operation Turquoise, the Legion was deployed into the middle of the Rwandan genocide. The mission was officially a humanitarian intervention to create a safe zone for refugees. But the reality was a political and moral catastrophe. The French government had a history of supporting the Hutu-led regime, and the Legion found themselves in the impossible position of protecting the very people who were orchestrating the slaughter. The erased man was now an instrument of a confused, morally compromised state policy. The legionnaires witnessed the aftermath of the massacres. The rivers filled with bodies. The churches turned into charnel houses. They had been trained for the cold intimacy of the kill, but nothing in the training at Castelnaudary had prepared them for the senseless, industrial-scale butchery of a civilian population. Rwanda was the moment the 20th century Legion died.
The disposable army was no longer just a tactical tool. It was a political liability in a world of 24-hour news and international war crimes tribunals. If this rigorous, objective exploration of the psychological and moral costs of elite soldiering provides a new perspective on history, please ensure you are subscribed. We investigate the units that operate where the law ends and the mission begins. In the comments, share your thoughts. Can a soldier truly erase his past if the horrors he witnesses in the present stay with him forever? As the 21st century dawned, the French Foreign Legion underwent its most significant modernization since the 1960s. The French state abolished conscription, meaning the regular French army was now a fully professional force. Some argued that this made the Legion obsolete. If the regular army was now professional, why did France still need a Foreign Legion? The answer lay in the grey zones of the new century. The attacks of September 11, 2001, triggered the global war on terror. For the Legion, this was a return to the terrain they knew best, the desert and the mountain. They were deployed into the mountains of Afghanistan, specifically the Sorobi and Kapisa provinces. This was Sissi territory, high altitude, dense vegetation, and a patient indigenous enemy. The legionnaires of the 2nd REP and the 2nd REI found themselves fighting a ghost in the Hindu Kush, just as their predecessors had fought ghosts in the jungles of Indochina and the mountains of Algeria. But the modern legionnaire was now a digital shadow. He was equipped with the Felin system, an integrated combat suite with thermal optics, encrypted radio, and a camera on his rifle that allowed him to fire around corners.
The thinking soldier was now a networked soldier. The DSPLE interrogators at Aubagne were now facing a new kind of recruit, the digital native. They were seeing men who had been erased, not by a criminal past, but by the hollow anonymity of the internet. They were seeing veterans of the Iraq and Afghan wars from other nations who were seeking a purer form of soldiering. The Gestapo had to adapt. They began to use social media forensics and dark web scraping to verify the identities of the men at the gate. The anonymat paper remained, but it was now backed by a global digital dragnet. The wooden hand of Captain d'Anjou remained in its reliquary, a silent observer of the Legion's transition into the age of cyber warfare and drone strikes. It remained the anchor of the contract, the one thing that the digital world could not erase. In the final part of this series, we will examine the Legion of today, the force that is currently operating in the Sahel,
in the jungles of French Guiana, and in the invisible fronts of the 2020s. We will look at the ultimate question. In a world where everyone is tracked, everyone is recorded, and everyone is known, what is the true cost of being an erased man? The march continues, 88 paces per minute, toward a world that is becoming more transparent, while the Legion remains in the shadows. The contract is still active. The erasure is still absolute. Stay with us. The final secrets of the Legion are about to be revealed. It is the 30th of April in Oban, and the air is perfectly still. The Way of the Sacred Wood, the central axis of the Legion's headquarters, is lined with 800 men in pristine white kepis. There is no music, no shouting, and no movement. The only sound is the rhythmic metallic clink of medals against wool tunics. Then, from the shadow of the regimental museum, a veteran officer emerges. He carries a small velvet-lined case.
Inside, resting on a bed of crimson silk, is the wooden hand of Captain Jean d'Anjou. As the hand is carried past the ranks, every legionnaire snaps to attention. It is a moment of collective, synchronized hypnosis. In this moment, the Polish laborer, the Russian paratrooper, the American wanderer, and the Brazilian fugitive are no longer individuals. They are the physical cells of a singular, immortal organism that has existed since 1831. The wooden hand is the tether that prevents the erased man from drifting away into the void of his own anonymity. It is the proof that even if your name is a lie, your sacrifice is a historical fact. But as the ceremony concludes and the men return to their barracks, they step out of the 19th century myth and into the terrifyingly transparent reality of the 2020s. To understand the modern French Foreign Legion, one must examine the digital trap. In the era of Captain d'Anjou, or even during the wars in Indochina and Algeria, a man's identity was a physical thing, a passport in a pocket, a birth certificate in a drawer. If the Legion took those papers and gave him a new name, he was functionally invisible to the rest of the world. He could disappear into the green hell of the jungle or the red hell of the desert, and the past could never find him. Today, identity is no longer physical. It is a biometric signature. It is a sequence of high-resolution facial data points stored in a cloud. It is a set of fingerprints in a global police database. It is a trail of digital breadcrumbs left across social media, banking apps, and GPS logs. The architecture of erasure is currently facing its most existential threat: the end of privacy. When a candidate walks up to the gate at Oban today, the DSPLE, the Internal Security Gestapo, no longer relies solely on psychological interrogation. They are now masters of open source intelligence, OSINT. While the candidate sits in a cell, stripped of his phone and his clothes, a team of analysts in a windowless room is scraping his digital life. They use facial recognition software to find him in the background of a stranger's Instagram post from 5 years ago. They track his IP addresses. They analyze the metadata of his deleted files. The Legion can give a man a new name on a piece of paper, but they cannot give him a new iris or new DNA. If a man is a fugitive from a high-level international crime, the digital world will eventually betray him. This has forced the Legion to move deeper into the grey zones. If they can no longer offer a man total anonymity from the law, they offer him something else: operational deniability. The modern Legion is the force that France uses when it wants to act in a way that is invisible to the French electorate and the international press. If you have found this hour-long investigation into the world's most enigmatic military institution intellectually rewarding, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. We avoid the sensationalism of modern media to provide a cold, objective analysis of the systems and individuals that define the sharp end of history. In the comments, I would be interested in your final thoughts on this series. In a world of total surveillance, is the erased man the last remaining form of true freedom? Or is he merely a ghost haunting a dead tradition? Your support allows us to continue this level of rigorous documentation. The modern thinking legionnaire is best observed in the Sahel, the vast arid belt of Africa stretching from Mali to Chad. In Operation Barkhane, the French military's decade-long counter-terrorism campaign, the Legion was the primary dismounted force. The Sahel is a landscape of absolute exposure. The heat reaches 50 degrees Celsius. The dust is a fine, abrasive powder that destroys helicopter engines and jams the most advanced assault rifles. In this environment, the French military's technological superiority, its drones, its satellites, its VBCI armored vehicles, often fails to find the enemy. The jihadist insurgents of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM, operate like the Sissi of the Winter War. They use the terrain as a cloak. They hide in the scrub, they move on motorcycles, and they blend into the nomadic populations. To find them, the legionnaires of the 2nd REI, 2nd Foreign Infantry Regiment, and the 1st REC, 1st Foreign Cavalry Regiment, must dismount. They must leave the air-conditioned safety of their armored hulls and walk. This is the last meter of warfare. It is where the disposable soldier becomes the essential soldier. A drone can see a motorcycle in the desert, but it cannot tell if the rider is a shepherd or a scout. Only a man on the ground, who has spent weeks living in the dust, whose senses have been sharpened by the Legionnaire's code, can make that distinction. The modern legionnaire in the Sahel is a hybrid of the ancient and the futuristic. He carries a FAMAS or an HK-417 with a thermal scope, but he also carries the Puko-style utility knife for skinning a goat or clearing a field of fire. He is networked to a command center in Paris, but he is psychologically isolated in a 19th century reality of thirst, exhaustion, and sudden, intimate violence. The contract in the 2020s has become more transactional. The men at the gate are no longer just fleeing war or crime. They are often fleeing the hollow nature of modern civilian life. They are looking for the intimacy of the perimeter, the absolute trust that can only exist between men who have been erased together. But there is one place where the Legion returns to its most primal roots, far from the digital dragnet of the Sahel. It is the 3rd Foreign Infantry Regiment, 3EREI, in French Guiana. Guiana is the green hell. It is a landscape of triple canopy jungle, humidity that rots the skin, and rivers filled with piranhas and caimans. The Legion's primary mission there is to protect the Guiana Space Center, the gateway for Europe's Ariane rockets. But their daily reality is the war against the garimperos, illegal gold miners who operate in the deep, unmapped interior. In the jungle of Guiana, technology is a liability. Satellites cannot see through the canopy. Radios have a range of only a few hundred meters. Drones are snagged by the vines. The legionnaires of the 3rd REI operate in small patrols, living in the mud for weeks. They do not use the pas légionnaire of 88 paces per minute. They move at the pace of the machete. They track the miners by the scent of their mercury and the sound of their pumps. It is a war of the 18th century fought with the weapons of the 21st. In the green hell, the erasure is absolute. There is no internet. There is no GPS. There is only the solidarity of the patrol. It is the one place where the original myth of the legionnaire still lives in its purest form. A man alone in the wild, forgotten by his country, serving a contract that he signed with his own thumbprint. As we conclude this flagship investigation into the architecture of erasure, we must address the final philosophical paradox of the French Foreign Legion. The French state is currently facing an era of unprecedented political and social fragmentation. The traditional pillars of French identity, the language, the secularism, the history, are being challenged by globalization and internal division. In this context, the Foreign Legion is no longer just a foreign unit, it has become the most French institution in the country. While the rest of France argues over its identity, the Legion simply executes its code. While the rest of the world becomes more transparent and more known, the Legion remains a place of shadows and secrets. The Legionnaire is a man who has died to the world so that he can live for the regiment. He has traded his freedom for a name he did not choose and a fatherland he did not belong to. He is the ultimate thinking soldier, because he has had to think his way out of his own life and into a new one. The wooden hand of Captain d'Anjou is returned to its vault in Aubagne. The glass is polished. The guards are rotated. It will wait there for another year, a piece of dead wood that has more power over the living than any living man. The final lesson of the French Foreign Legion is this: institutions do not survive through their technology or their budgets. They survive through their myth. The Legion has survived the collapse of 2 empires, the defeat in Indochina, the trauma of Algeria, and the rise of the digital age, because it offers the one thing the modern world cannot: the right to be forgotten. It is the architecture of erasure. It is a machine that takes the broken parts of the human race and builds something that will not break. The march continues, 88 paces per minute, toward the next border, toward the next shadow, toward the next erasure. Legio Patria Nostra. Thank you for watching this hour-long deep dive into the soul of the Legion. We are grateful for your time and your intellect. If you have been moved or informed by this series, please share it with those who value the unvarnished truth of military history. The contract is complete. The identities are declared. The silence of Aubagne returns. Stay objective. Stay resilient. The worst is yet to come, and the Legion will be there to meet it.